Here's a simple example of XML. Simple, but pretty typical. So here's an element. So it consists of the opening tag, chapter, some content, and then a closing tag. And the closing tag needs to just be a / and the same name as the opening chapter, opening tag name. Okay, so this consists of a single element, some content, and then the closing tag. Now, elements don't have to have content, so I have a chapters object. Now, in the XML world, in XML speak, chapters doesn't have content because it doesn't have any embedded text of its own. It does, though, contain these two chapter elements. But you can also have completely empty elements as well. You have a lot of flexibility. But then, these chapter elements are said to belong to the chapters element. So it's contained within it. And then you can also have attributes. In this case, I have on the chapters element a single attribute set to the value of 2. Okay, so if you're not familiar with XML, that's a very brief overview. It's a very common format. As I mentioned, it's used extensively within the .NET framework, and so there are all kinds of features that you can use in order to work with it. It's a very extensive topic, and so I'm going to give you a taste of what you can do with XML, but there's a lot more that you can do. Okay, so I'm going to close that. And here I have some sample code that shows off some of the features you can use to write XML, to build it dynamically, and then read it back. So the first class I'm going to be using is the XML Writer class. It provides a number of methods for writing XML to a file or in memory. And then you can use the create method to create new instances of this class, which in essence creates new XML. And then you can pass as a parameter the name of the XML file that you want to create. Okay, so this is the main object that I'm going to be using here. XML Writer. I'm newing it up by using the create method. This is called a factory method. It's a different way of creating an instance of an object. But the nice thing about doing it this way is that I can provide a path to the file that I want to create. This file doesn't exist yet, or it could. And then I can pass settings. And so these settings are coming from this XML Writer settings object. This provides a number of properties that give you control over how your code writes XML. You can use the indent property here in order to specify that you want elements to be indented. Now generally, extraneous white space is not important in XML. You don't want it. It's just going to bloat the file. But you can include it. If you're going to be reading it and you want it to make it more human readable, you can include some pretty indenting. And that's what this indent property does. And then you can use the indent chars property to specify which character to use for the indenting. I don't do that here, so it's going to be the default spaces. And then I can do new line chars to indicate what characters I want to use for line breaks. And typically I'm going to use a carriage return line feed as I have here. Okay, so once these statements have executed, I have this XML Writer object in memory that is set with these settings. And by the way, there are a lot of other settings that you can do. You have a lot of control over the format of the XML that you create. Okay, so now I'm ready to start writing the actual XML. So first thing I'm going to do is execute the write start document. And that writes the XML declaration at the top of the file. In fact, let me go back over here and open up that file again. Okay. I have Internet Explorer set as my default reader for XML. And so this is that line that the write start document just created. And I'm passing a value of true in order to add the standalone attribute. So I come back over here, standalone is true. Okay? So that's what happened when I passed that parameter there. Okay, and what standalone indicates is that the XML doesn't rely on other documents or files. You can have a whole hierarchy of files that that are built on each other and incorporate the XML into different files. So you can get very complex with this stuff. Okay, and then you have several different methods that you can use in order to write XML. Use the write start element, as I have here, in order to create an XML tag. And I'm passing as the parameter the name of the element that I want to create. Then I'm using the write attribute string to add the total attribute, setting it equal to the value of 2 to the current element that I'm working with that is open, which is called chapters. And then I'm going to write element string. So this is going to write an element and put a string in it. I'm going to use that same one to write another chapter element with a different string in it. And then I'm going to write end element. Now notice that I write the start element, but I haven't closed that. And the reason is because I want this attribute to be added to the chapters element, and I want these child elements here to be added to chapters as well. So I don't close off the chapters element until I'm done writing all of its content, all of its child elements. And then, in order to close off the stream and write it to the disk file, I'm going to call the close method right there. And that releases the file handle. So this is how easy it is to write XML. There's very strong support through methods and properties for creating this data. This is way better than building XML using string concatenation. Before the .NET framework, that's what we had to do. And so your string concatenation code can be very big, bloated, and messy, and so forth. Okay, so this is much easier. Okay, so that's the code that I used in order to create this XML file, and it has all of the features that I need. All right, just to show you, I'll go ahead and execute the code. Actually, I'll close this first, so there's no handle on it. I'll execute that, and D for write and read XML, and that's the output. Okay. And so now I've recreated that file. Now, the rest of the code in the method reads that data. And it does a couple different ways. So in order to read data, I'm going to use an XML reader object. This provides a number of methods for reading XML from a file or from memory. And you can use the create method to create a new instance. So once again, it's using a factory method in order to create an instance of the XML reader that is then going to be referenced by the reader variable there. And once again, I pass the parameter at the location of the file that I want to read. And this file needs to exist. I'll get an exception if it doesn't. All right, then what the read method does is it reads each node in the XML one at a time. And a node is an element, its attributes, its different kinds of contents. Essentially, it's every little bit and piece of an XML file. And then here I'm using the node type property to determine whether this node is an element or the node is text representing a value. So if it's text, I just want to write it out to the console window. So that's why I got the two chapter names. So the chapters element doesn't have a node type of text. It's not until it iterates into the chapter element that it has content. And it just goes ahead and uses the value property to get the value of that node, and then it writes it out to the console window. And after it loops through, reads all of those different nodes within the XML file, then it closes that, and that closes the stream and releases the file handle. Okay, so I'll once again run this, and D, and so I get the value of that chapter and the value of that chapter. Okay? There is another technique that you can use to read XML data, and that's with the read to following method. So that's what I do here. I'm creating a new instance of the XML reader, so I'm overwriting that previous reader. And I'm using that same file. But now I'm using the read to following, and I'm specifying the chapter element. So this is going to read the XML until it finds the next element with the name that I pass as a parameter, which is chapter. And then as long as I'm able to read chapter elements from the XML, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to read the inner XML, which is the content of that chapter element. So it's the content within it. And so this code is going to give the same results as that code right there. So this is just one small example that well, not just with XML, but particularly with XML. In XML, there are usually a lot of different ways to do the exact same thing. And that's actually a common theme throughout the .NET framework. It has a lot of flexibility, and that's almost kind of why the .NET framework seems overwhelming, because there are multiple ways of doing things. Some perform better, some have a lighter touch on memory, some are more appropriate for different kinds of scenarios or different formats of data. And so once you find something like the XML reader object, your work isn't done, because you need to figure out how to best use the XML reader object. So just a word of warning about the .NET framework. And that's where Google and Binging will help you find stuff, but definitely be careful about code that you find out floating out on the internet. They're just like any other kind of information, medical information, personal finance information on the web. Not all the code you find on the internet is good quality code. So just be aware of that. Look at it with a critical eye. Now, one thing about the XML reader is that it provides forward-only processing of an XML file. So once I've read through all of the XML using a reader, I can't go back. And that, in fact, is why I had to recreate the XML reader object here, because this instance of the XML reader class was used up. I was at the end of the XML. So I had to recreate it. Now I can start at the beginning, use the read to following, and I can go through all of the XML again. There are other objects within the system.xml namespace that don't have that restriction. So they're not really working on a stream as such, but you can jump around more. So essentially, but what you're doing essentially is you're completely parsing the XML document into memory and then reading different memory locations. Whereas the XML reader is pretty much parsing as you go, as you flow through the XML, which is why you can't go backwards.